Hello and welcome to Dig It. I'm Peter Brown and hosting the show with me today is Chris Day. Hi Chris.
Hi Peter.
Well, it's been a windy and wet few weeks, hasn't it, Chris, since our last podcast?
Certainly has, after that chilly December, and it's not very nice, and we've had rain after rain on very saturated soil as well, which is not good for our plants or our crops.
And some really warm days. I was up at the beehives the other day because it was 12 degrees.
Yes, yeah, unseasonably warm, isn't it?
How many times do you get 12 degrees in the sort of start of January? It should be 3 or 4 degrees from my memory. But anyway, I suppose that's the way things are at the moment, isn't it? Anyway, so talking about nature and gardening, who we got coming in? Who have we got on the podcast today, Chris?
Right, Peter, we've got a bit of a treat today, actually. We've got Charles Dowding. He's the leading champion of no-dig gardening.
Okay, now I've done a bit of research into this. I'm quite interested to learn an awful lot more about this idea. No dig.
No dig, it sounds like it's made in heaven, doesn't it?
Well, every spring I get the rotavator out and I generally spend about a day fighting with it, rotavating the allotment, and I mean it does a lovely job, but obviously I'm always aware of all the worms and the sort of wildlife in the ground, and by all accounts, rotavating isn't the greatest for the worm count.
Definitely, and for that mycorrhizal activity as well in those top few centimetres of growth of the soil as well. And, of course, wet weather as well can't be good for the soil structure.
No, so hopefully I'm going to learn today how I can do absolutely nothing. That's what I'm looking forward to. But I bet it won't be like that, will it?
No, possibly not. Charles has got a huge following on his Instagram, and he's very much out there for a gardener of a few years. He's been actually giving. He's been born out of gardening in a way. 40 years of growing, analysing, comparing, and recommending varieties, and he's been growing actually vegetables since the early 1980s.
Yep.
Having gardened on 4 different locations and grown literally thousands of crops. And Charles is actually revered in the world of veg growing. Even Monty Don, that Monty Don of Gardener's World fame, stated that Charles has become the guru of no-dig gardening. He's a real good grower, organic, and has fabulous produce.
Excellent. Well, let's hear what he has to say.
Let's do that. So, Charles, welcome to Dig It, and where do we find you this rather grey January day?
I'm in South Somerset, near Castle Carey and Bruton.
Oh, lovely. Obviously, looking at your amazing amount of work you've done over the years, probably the first question we would probably want to ask and to explain to our Dig It listeners is, where did your no-dig gardening adventure begin?
Oh, wow. I guess when I just left university, I grew up on a dairy farm just near here. I'm a Somerset man, and then became a vegetarian actually when I was at university, and got interested therefore in nutrition, and then from that got interested in how food was grown. Then I became an organic grower when I started market gardening in 1982, and I used the farm rotavator, and then I thought, hang on a minute, maybe there's different ways to do this. And I'd done a bit of reading around, and no-dig has been practiced. You know, it's got a bit of a pedigree, but a very, very unknown one. And I found people who'd been doing no-dig and swore by it, and particularly commented on there being much less weeding to do. So I thought I'd give it a go. I made beds, though. I rotavated 1.5 acres and shaped up beds by hand with a spade, raised beds. That took a while. And once they were made, I didn't want to rotivate again, so I thought I'll just leave them, and that was the beginning of my no-dig.
And so, for the total idiot like myself, Charles, no-dig, you mentioned less weeding. Is it really as simple as it sounds?
Well, I almost hate to say it, but actually it is. It's what I noticed in gardening, well, actually in life as a whole, teachers and people who know a bit, they will tend to make it sound more complicated than perhaps it really is, and that sort of keeps them in a position of knowledge and power, if you like.
Yep.
And there's actually a saying I really like: the difference between power and influence. And with power, the more you share, the less you have. And with influence, the more you share, the more you have. So I'm always sharing, and I'm not afraid to say if things are simple, because I want my listeners, students, whoever, to really understand what they're doing, and then they will be successful, and then they can teach other people. The essence of no dig is really simple. You leave soil alone, leave it undisturbed. That allows soil organisms which are already there to do their work, which is what they want to do, without being disturbed. And then you feed them. So when we talk about feeding the soil, I think one might, in conventional horticulture, say you feed the plants, but it's more about feeding the soil is how I put it. And strictly speaking, that's feeding soil life or soil organisms. And then they get busier and multiply, and that makes your soil more fertile, more aerated, more structured, and more full of goodness that's available to plants, because that it's favouring the biology, which helps to make nutrients and moisture more available. And that's it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting.
So I'll sign off now. I told you, I've explained no dig.
That's it. We can all go home now. Brilliant.
So do you think, Charles, that anybody, anyone can master your no dig principles? Is it that straightforward?
Yeah, exactly. That's the easy bit, if you like. Then the practical side of things does need a bit more explaining. Like, how do you feed soil organisms? Well, usually with a mulch, and I recommend compost, particularly because we're in a sluggy climate in the UK mostly. So compost, being well decomposed, doesn't offer hiding places for slugs, undecomposed lumps, that kind of thing. And it's how you get hold of enough compost, that kind of thing. Not that you don't need more compost for no dig compared to digging. It's just that I think it's more visible, and I emphasise it because it's just so brilliant. It's such a useful starting point, and it leads on to the less weeding that you mentioned, because you end up with a surface mulch of compost. Even if it has weed seeds in, they're very easy to pull out because it's soft, and you create this weed-free surface, which is less work, but is also feeding your soil down below, and kind of doing the work for you, if you like. So at the beginning, there can be more work to get hold of enough compost to make a thin surface there. It doesn't have to be massive. It could be 1 or 2 inches. It's up to you how thick you make it.
So you're saying you started with 1.5 acres of land that you rotivated, and that's a reasonable size area, isn't it? Is that what sort of made you think about no-dig gardening, and how do I get away with not having to weed such a vast area, or what was the trigger for you to get into it?
It was exactly that, actually, as it happens, weeding, because I didn't go to college. What I did to learn was I went around going on lots of farm walks in the spring and summer of 1982, looking at organic market gardens. That's what I wanted to do, organic. And everywhere I looked, they were just fighting the weeds. They were so overrun with weeds that they didn't, I thought, have time to really, do the more constructive jobs of planting and picking, that kind of thing. Or the weeds were just getting ahead and they were losing crops. So I just felt, for me, that was number one priority. Yeah, I needed to be on top of the weeds. So that certainly led me to no dig. And mulching, I used quite a bit of hay and straw, actually, which I wouldn't do now, but that was all I had at the time. Yeah. I didn't have access to compost for mulching initially. And then I did find quite a few slugs harbouring, hiding under the hay and straw. So, I was learning all the time. I've tried a lot of things over the years, and the practicalities that I teach now are fine-tuned over all that period of time into what, the simplest, easiest, quickest, most effective and efficient way of working, which you can scale down and end up actually, you could make 1 bed, you could make 50 beds. It's the same principle. It just gets a bit more, a bit different when you go beyond maybe 1 acre of cropping, talking about producing vegetables, that kind of thing. And flowers, actually. There's a lot of no-dig flower farmers now on quite big areas of ground.
So, Charles, so somebody would say an average garden, or a new gardener coming into horticulture, what's the practicalities of the size of the bed, the width of the bed for no dig? Do you have any sort of formula which tends to work?
It's quite open, actually. The one beautiful thing about a no dig bed is that you can walk on it if you need to. It's because you haven't disturbed the structure through any kind of digging or cultivation. The soil stays firm underneath your surface layer of compost. Firm as opposed to compact, and then those two conditions are very different. So the firm soil, which is nonetheless open, it's got a lattice structure, a matrix of holes where roots can travel and soil organisms burrow through all the time. But that firm soil can take your weight if need be. So if you want a wider bed, it's not the end of the world, because you can put your foot on or even walk on it to reach the middle. So which means you can tailor your bed width to fit your plot size, or have variable bed widths. But I would recommend that the size I find most useful is 4 foot, 1.2 meter wide, and any length you like. Having said that, I would recommend shorter, smaller beds, as in less long. So say I find beds of 1.2 meter wide, 2 meters long. That's about 4 by 6.5 feet. Really handy because they're just nice units for planting up that bed with, say, broccoli or onions or carrots, whatever it might be. You've got a little block that you can cover with a fleece or mesh if you want to, that kind of thing. But it's not huge and it's not massive, and I'm not going to overwhelm you. Amount to look after or also to harvest.
Okay. And with your sort of no-dig philosophy and tending way of gardening, have you ever sort of done a worm count or an animal count in the soil to see if it makes a big difference?
Interesting question. Yeah, well, the problem is I don't really want to go digging a hole. And I know, I'm joking a bit. I can see what you mean. That would be interesting. I'll tell you what I do though. Is I do comparison beds. So I've got two different trials going on here. One is comparing a dug bed, which I dig every December and incorporate the compost, with a no-dig bed where I put the same amount of compost simply on top.
Yep.
So already I save a couple of hours. Each bed is 1.5 by 5 meters, about 5 feet by 16.
Okay.
And then both beds I crop the same vegetables right the way through the season, pick at the same time, water the same amount, and compare the crops. And what I noticed, slightly different answer to what you might have expected, but when I was digging the dug bed for the 11th time this December, there were a lot of worms. And I'd be very surprised if there weren't a lot in the no-dig bed. I just don't want to dig a hole. We do see quite a few. There's no doubt they're there because we see the worm cast on top as well. But generally speaking, I was thinking, God, this is actually pretty impressive. I'm finding a lot of worms in soil I've been digging. And that is because I'm putting on a reasonable amount of compost. That's putting on 1 inch every year. Yeah. And that's measured after the rain has settled it down. So it's not the fluffy. I used to say 2 inches, but that wasn't accurate really because I now count it as the settled depth, if you like.
Once the air's gone out of it a bit.
Yeah, so we're putting on that much compost, which for a 1.5 by 5 meter bed, that was 2 big wheelbarrows. But for that size of bed, that is giving 100 kilos a year of vegetables.
Wow!
Actually, last year it was 113 from that one bed, and that included like 8 kilos of onions, 13 kilos potatoes, 10 kilos lettuce, 8 kilos of beetroot, and so on. A bit of everything, and that. I use that as an example, actually, to encourage people. If any of your listeners have not got a huge garden, you can, with one bed or just two, whatever, small area, you can do a lot of vegetables and keep cropping. That's another nice thing. It's a big advantage with no-dig because you haven't got soil preparation. So you can be, say, what I do with onions, I have 2 rows of onions I grow across the bed. And they're maturing in July, not ready to harvest, say, till early August. But in early July, I pop kale transplants between the 2 rows of onions, and the kale gets established while the onions are finishing. So then when we harvest the onions, you've already got kale, it's done the hard yards, if you like. It's got its roots down. And within a month, you can be picking kale, then only a month after you pick the onions. So you're doing those kinds of overlaps is a really nice bonus of no-dig and just having ground ready at any time to pop in new plants. And I keep succeeding. I really like the phrase succeeding with succession. So that's going on all through the summer, keeping the ground full. I found that rotation is less important with no-dig when the soil is really healthy and well-fed. I've got a trial area where last year we harvested potatoes in July for the 8th successive year in the same soil. Oh. And actually, last year's harvest was the best ever. And that's also with keeping my own potatoes for seed. So, I'm kind of not deliberately breaking rules, but I'm certainly stretching the boundaries and finding some really nice things. Mainly, I would say, as a result of having soil in really healthy condition.
Yeah, I mean, they always say, isn't it? A good, healthy soil, reaps benefits, doesn't it? And I'm quite,
yes,
and
that
Charles,
lovely old saying. You must have heard it. The answer lies in the soil.
It most definitely does. And I think, the idea of sort of intercropping and sort of successional planting is something which, for new gardeners is a whole new world of terminology. But actually, practicality is you're using your soil more effectively. You're getting more crop for.
And if you look at nature, it's a lot of it's about copying nature, but obviously adapting it to vegetable growing in this case. But it's how nature does it all the time. You see a plant maturing, there's new seedlings have germinated underneath, and before you know it, we call them weeds and all this. They've taken over. So it's that overlap is happening continually, and copying those principles and working them into a veg garden is fascinating. Actually, I really enjoy that.
So, Charles, on basically starting your dig garden, could you sort of break it down into sort of the sort of three sort of phases, which might make it easy for our listeners to understand?
Yeah, absolutely. And because there's one thing I was realizing I hadn't mentioned, which is pathways between beds, because that's a very important part that often doesn't get mentioned. And what I recommend is, particularly with vegetables, which are very hungry, demanding plants, that you keep any path next to a bed clear of weeds. And that means the soil is available, both in moisture and food, for vegetables close to the edge to root into. And they can do that because I recommend not having wooden sides. I've got here a third of an acre of crop ground with no wooden sides on my beds. And that means that my pathways, which are 40 centimetres, 16 inches wide for the 1.2 metre or 4 foot beds. That's a nice matching measurement. The pathways are not too wide, but it's enough space to comfortably walk between, push a wheelbarrow between. So if you're starting out, think in those terms, how you're going to set up your beds and paths, how you're going to run your beds, which orientation. It's often said that they must run north-south, which makes sense if all you're growing is, say, runner beans, sweet corn, and tall tomatoes, because they're shading plants. But most vegetables actually grow very low to the ground. So you don't have to have them north-south. For me, the main consideration is where you enter your plot, if you like, where you've got access to your area, and you want the pathways running away from that. It might be a concrete path or whatever. And so, that will govern where you put them. And one more is slope, actually, because again, contrary to what's often said, I find it best to run beds up and down a slope, not across it, because then if you try and run beds across even a moderate slope, the compost and water you apply to the surface of your bed will tend to run down the bed and into the path below it, because the bed itself is on a slope, unless you terrace your bed, which is a lot of work. And so I found in my previous garden I had quite a slope, maybe 10 degrees, and I'd run the beds up and down, and that way any compost I put on would run down along the top of the bed and not into the path below, because the bed surface was level. I hope that makes sense. I'm sure anyone with a slope could get the sense of that. So little things like that, can make quite a difference. Have a think before you rush in and just plonk a bit of compost on the ground. How you're going to set it up, layout of beds and paths, and don't if you're a beginner at this, don't take in too big an area. Just 1 or 2 beds, like I've mentioned. You can get a lot of food, and you'll enjoy it much more if you start small and you kind of stay in control and not get overwhelmed. I often feel with allotments, that sometimes you'll get people new to it being given a huge, great space. I mean, what are they going to do with that? And then they get a bit overwhelmed with weeds because they can't quite manage it all, and that can be very disheartening. So, if any of you have got access to a big allotment space, think about sharing it. You'll have more fun, and doing a smaller area can actually give you just as much in the end. With the beds that you make, and you'll put some compost on the ground, if there's a lot of weeds, some cardboard on the weeds really helps in just that initial stage. You simply lay any brown, preferably thick cardboard, like it could be Amazon boxes, whatever. Make sure you overlap the edges. The idea is to exclude light from what's currently growing there, what we call weeds, because you don't want them growing under your bed and then or through. And but the cardboard, then the compost on top of that. And if it's very dry weather, which it's not at the moment, you wouldn't need to do it. But if it was spring, give a bit of water to the cardboard. But normally we don't do that. And yeah, you're ready to go then. If the compost you've managed to get hold of is reasonably well decomposed, you can make a bed like this and plant into it on the same day. But quite often the compost sellers will sell you compost that's not really mature. It might look more mature than it is. And so it's actually good to make beds in winter, and then they'll be ready by the time everything's matured and settled a bit by spring.
Okay. And does it matter what sort of base soil you're starting with?
That's a good question. Yeah. Well, yeah, I think, in my experience, that bit is often overstated. It's good to know what your soil is. Like, for example, is it moisture-retentive clay or is it free-draining, chalky and sandy? Both of those you can grow great plants on, but with different results, it must be said. And like the one I prefer for vegetables actually is clay. It works brilliantly with clay. Yeah, totally.
So good for our local customers around here in Buckingham, because we've got loads of clay. It's some very heavy soil. So.
Well, you need to stock a nice lot of compost for them. And mushroom compost is great if you can get it. There's a bit of a shortage of supply, I think, at the moment, because farmers have realised how valuable it is. But basically, yeah, compost on clay is ideal because you've got all that moisture and nutrient retention underneath, and you're not kind of fighting the clay, for want of a better word, but the soil organisms are keeping it open and aerated for you, and you get the benefit of it while you just work or, plant and sow into the soft surface. So with clay, well, I put on, an inch a year. That's my maintenance dose. But to start out, I would look to get 3 or 4 inches up to 10 centimeters of compost on your bed. And on pathways, I would use cardboard as well to suppress the weeds. Thick cardboard on your pathways, and then maybe a little bit of wood chip or something, so that when you walk on it, you're not smashing the cardboard.
That's good. Looking at your website, your pictures of your 3 trial beds, which look absolutely amazing, I have to say.
Yeah.
How do you keep that area looking so good and weed free? What's the secret?
There is no secret, Chris. It's I take it for granted now because I just got so used to it. But I can assure you that we hardly weed that area, and it still amazes me actually, but less than it used to because I have got used to it. But once you've got soil, I would say there's 2 things. So the soil is the organisms are well fed. That makes them happy, and they're not disturbed, which makes them even happier. And that links to my understanding of, why do weeds grow? Why do sometimes we get explosions of weeds? There's obviously the clear one that if lots of weed seeds blow in, which I do get here sometimes. If the dandelions in the nearby field all go to flower at the same time, then you get the wind blow the seeds over in there. We'll be pulling quite a few dandelions. That's the main weeding we do actually in the summer. But beyond that, there's very few. The soil doesn't need to grow weeds. It's in a very calm condition, and I can illustrate that best by the other extreme, which I've experienced, is rotivating. And when I rotivated some ground to sow some carrots back in the 1980s, before I knew better, and I did an acre, and I could not believe how much chickweed came up. And there's a saying around here that chickweed follows the rotivator. And I think the reason is, if you look at what a rotivator does, it's really smashing up the soil and breaking up the particles into tiny pieces, and that's not a natural state for soil. So it needs to bind together again, and chickweed does that brilliantly with its tough and wiry roots. So therefore, you can expect the chickweed after rotivating. Obviously there needs to be a few seeds there, but if they are, and that's what happened. So I lost an acre of carrots from that little experiment, and that taught me quite a lesson. But on noted ground, I very rarely see chickweed, and I think that's why. So it's not difficult to maintain. We spend very little time weeding here. It's a pleasure job actually, because it's just that we can skim over the ground quite quickly, or walk over, usually pulling a few, and just have a chance to look at everything else while we're doing it. But we weed little and often. I would say that's the key. So you're never spending long on it, but it's still worth doing every, say, 10 days in the summer, just to make sure none are going seed and you catch them all.
And Have you, I mean, just thinking about my allotment and the fact I've got mare's tail growing on it, which I've been propagating well for the last 10 years, and it's just an absolute nightmare. I mean, I try and dig it out. Does that benefit in the same way?
Is it a wet spot? Are you in a damp situation?
It's on Northamptonshire Ironstone, so it's not actually that badly drained. It just seems to have a sort of good holding in the allotments around us and keeps on coming in and growing. And
yeah, I mean, it is difficult because even if you got rid of it, it'll spread in from nearby plots, won't it?
Yeah.
So you're never going to get totally clear. But what I haven't got it here. I mean, I've got some terrible bindweed which we can get rid of in 2 years. What I find generally with perennial weeds with no dig, they are easier to control. I think that's the best I can offer you.
Okay.
So they pull out. We don't dig them out. We don't try and dig out the parent root, but we do keep removing the regrowth, which with the aim of being persistent enough with that, the parent root, I call it, what's deep down, doesn't get any stronger and, if anything, gets weaker over time. I think that's the most realistic way of looking at mare's tail. I had a guy on a course here once, actually, who said, I got rid of mare's tail in 11 years of hoeing. But I think he was being really thorough. I mean, it shows it can be done. He said literally he got rid of it, but it was
off with lack of light, I suppose. That's one way of...
Yeah, weakens it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I would say your best bet is keeping on top of it. But surface mulches help. You just got to do everything that helps, basically.
Brilliant. Okay, we'll keep on persevering. I'll tell you in 10 years' time whether I've got rid of it or not.
And
yeah, sure. Well, we've got where I got really bad bindweed here. We took on a plot 2 years ago, new field, and it had a huge amount of bindweed roots in. And initially, I did use black plastic. We still grew potatoes and squash, but it's much easier to control when you've got plastic, at least suppressing some of the weed growth, and then remove the plastic. Then there's a lot of pulling out of what we could see. And since then, that was first year, and year 2 last year, we were regularly removing, using a trowel to lever out the new growth. And actually, by the end of the summer, it had almost disappeared. I was really pleased. It can be done. You just got to be vigorous. And it's also about doing the pathways as well as the beds. So, the classic one I see sometimes on the allotments, they're doing a really nice job of keeping the couch grass under control in the bed, but there's loads of couch grass in the pathway, so it just keeps spreading back in. So that's why I was saying that, get your wheat paths weed-free as well as your beds, and then you can reach this nice weed-free state.
Okay. Charles, we mentioned about mulching materials, and how obviously for gardeners, if they produce in their own compost, that's one way of bringing in the mulch. What other alternatives are there for mulches in which you perhaps trialled at your own on your own garden?
Well, yeah, I would buy in some to start with. If you are, especially if you want to grow really amazing vegetables, it's worth it. I call it a one-off initial investment. Mm-hmm. You don't need to buy a lot of compost every year, but if you're starting out, it can really get you off to a flying start. And I would recommend mushroom compost more than any. We've just been doing some trials here, and that one came out as a really good result. The green waste compost is somewhat less nutritious, and it can take longer to get mature. It's often sold in a half-mature state, and it's hydrophobic, so it won't hold water for quite a few months until it really settles down. You've got to be a bit careful. And another compost I've often recommended, but less so now, is animal manures, horse manure and cow manure. Particularly horse manure now, it's risk of this pesky weed killer, which should not be allowed. Paralid weed killers, which are used by some farmers to control broadleaf weeds, and they're so persistent that if the horse can eat the hay, and the hay comes out through the horse's stomach into the poo can sit in a manure heap for years, and this stuff doesn't break down. It doesn't decompose in the manure heap. So if the horse happened to have eaten hay or grass with this stuff on, you can have contaminated manure, and what that will do is cause problems for your peas, beans, tomatoes, and potatoes in particular. They're very susceptible. And if any of you listening see or have seen leaves curling inward at the growing point of those plants, legumes and solanums, that's a sign that this stuff is in there. And the only remedy I know is sunlight. that you leave it on the surface, sun on it will degrade this stuff over the course of probably a summer. So actually, one other source of fertility is wood chip, but that you're not buying compost. Obviously, usually you're getting it delivered fresh, which is fine, and it's great mulch, as you know, for pathways and shrubs and things. But if you keep it for a couple of years, that will turn into something close to compost, and that's a pretty good source of organic matter and fertility.
Yeah.
Excellent. So it's no dig gardening. It's not no weed gardening, really, is it? Now, with regards to weeding, is your preference to sort of pick out the little shoots of weeds as you're getting to see them, or hoeing? I mean, as I read, sort of tilling is obviously very bad for breaking up the microfauna of the surface of the soil. What are your thoughts on hoeing, and is that still
hoeing,
okay?
Well, hoeing is a very shallow thing. I would say good hoeing, you're not going more than 2-3 centimeters, and you're skimming through the surface layer. And that's linked to the other part of what you're doing when you're hoeing. We don't hoe much, but we do. It's definitely good to have a hoe ready in case. If you happen to have spread a compost which has got a lot of weed seeds, and it's usually in early spring, so late February through March, and preferably on a bright breezy day, if you skim through the surface in the morning ideally, so that everything dries by evening, and the stage at which to do it is the key thing. And the old saying, many of the old sayings I find really annoying actually, but this one's really good, and it's hoe your weeds before you see them. And of course it's not literally true, but it's the kernel of it is that you're looking to disturb germinating weed seeds, if you like, almost before they're little plants. And so in early spring, there's a lot of things like grasses and fat hen and chickweed and goodness knows what, groundsel. They're all just making their first move. And if you can disturb them as even little germinated seeds with little roots on, and get them dry before they've had a chance to grow, you've done a huge weeding job without hardly ever seeing a weed. And so that's what it's called, a weed strike, and that's something I would always recommend, and we do here if I am expecting a weed problem. So in other words, I'm going out. The big difference, I'm looking for weeds. I'm not waiting to be overwhelmed by them. And it's really good to be in that habit, be on the front foot. Don't be afraid of weeds, and just tackle them when you see them. And like you suggesting, if I see one, I'll pull it. And they pull out easily from the surface compost. But I don't just leave it. And quite often, if I'm walking through the garden doing something completely different and I spot a weed, I will stop. I'll even put down something I'm carrying maybe, and I'll pull out that weed, because I've noticed how later on you might walk past it and not notice it. They're good at disguising themselves. So if I see one, I remove it, because I do want to maintain a weed-free state. That gives you peace of mind. It creates a beautiful garden, and you know that there's not any weeds going to seed. You're not building up any future problems. So even if I've got, say, a crop of onions or broccoli, and the broccoli, say, is a better example, the leaves are smothering the ground, you can't see the ground, but I would still go and have a look between the leaves, just make sure there's not a little groundsel there which is about to drop 100 seeds, that kind of thing. So it's about being on top of it, but it's not onerous.
Okay.
Charles, obviously on your plot there, you do produce a lot of your own compost. Any tips for our Dig It listeners on home composting?
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I've noticed recently actually, and I'm really pleased that there seems to be more interest in people making their own compost.
Most definitely.
Great. And I think it's partly because it's been made to sound too difficult. I think the way the RHS have taught gardening, and I don't think I'm sort of saying any top secrets here, but it's been a bit formulaic, I feel, and I think some of them would acknowledge that. And we need more understanding of principles, and with making compost, actually, it's not too difficult. Once you get those key the essence of what you're doing, and one thing is to have a balance of green and brown materials. So you're not going to just load in loads of grass mowings 100% because it'll all go soggy, and you need something fibrous to go with that. So that's where it's good to have, set by in the winter, create a stock of tree leaves, woody prunings, anything of that nature, even paper and bits of cardboard, which you can use in through the summer to add to the volume of green which you have through the summer months. In the summer months, you have more green material. In the winter months, you have more brown. In an ideal world, we'd be mixing them up. So you've got to do that thing of keeping the brown ready for the green. So balancing your mix is not scientific measurements. It's a rough proportion and practice. It's difficult to give precision measurements just because every garden is different, and as a result, every compost is different, which is wonderful. There's one thing that makes a big difference, and it's misunderstood, I've noticed, is about keeping in the moisture and warmth. I think it was Shul Cooper who originally said have compost heaps with slatted sides. He was up in your part of the world, was he? Hartley Manor? Is that anywhere? Or was that Hertfordshire? No, I think that was Hertfordshire.
I think, yeah, he was Hertfordshire, from memory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He ran something called the Good Gardeners Association in the 1950s. He wrote 37 gardening books, so I've got a way to go yet. And he's an amazing guy. But he was on TV and he said something like, have your slatted sides to your heap so the air can flow through your compost heaps. And it kind of makes sense. But if you think about it, it doesn't actually, because you don't want air flowing through a compost heap. It'll take out all the heat and some of the moisture. You want to enclose your sides, and we actually line pallet-sided compost heaps, because pallets are brilliant improvisation, to make
it's a good structure, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I just use 8 wires, so 2 wires, top and bottom on each corner. So and no posts. It's literally 4 pallets, 8 wires, 8 pieces of wire, job done. And it's sitting on the ground, and we'll actually put a bit of cardboard on the ground around it, just to stop weeds like cooch or nettles or anything pushing up into the compost. But it's sitting on the ground on weeds even, and then you're just piling stuff on top of that and filling. But we line the sides with cardboard. So on the inside of the pallet, as the ingredients are added, you just pack in a bit more cardboard, so that you've always got a cardboard layer between what you're adding and the outside, and that holds the warmth closer to the edge, keeps in the moisture. I found that I'm telling you this from experience, it's not just some idea. It's made a noticeable difference since we've done that, and we're just making amazing compost from these very simple pallet-sized heaps, which usually we find we can finish in 2 months. The quicker you finish them, the hotter they get, and the quicker you'll make your compost, basically. But if it takes you a whole year to finish a heap, well, that's also fine. It just will take longer, and you probably won't need to turn it because it'll be mature at the bottom before, when you get to the top sort of thing. I find that we turn our heaps just once, no more, just one turn, because it makes a noticeable difference. So if you don't turn, fair enough, but if you do manage to turn a heap, which just means moving it from one place to another, have an empty bay next door, we get just really almost a potting compost actually within about 6 to 8 months. But that's with making a heap in 2 months, a pallet-sized heap, and that means that actually that's quite a lot of material. And even on an allotment, I think you'd struggle to fill such a heap in 2 months unless you bring in quite a lot of raw material from elsewhere, which is actually I'd recommend. To make enough compost, you need to scrounge. So coffee grounds from local cafes and a bit of old wood chip, preferably the old wood chip, not the new, just because that's a bit of woody structure that gives quality to the heap. A bit of paper, a bit of cardboard, go and mow someone else's grass or whatever, just always be on the lookout for whatever extra materials you can add. And it's fun. It really, you're doing something really productive. You're using waste material to make something valuable. So if you haven't tried it yet, I'd urge anyone to have a go. If you're a very small garden, those Dalek things that you probably sell, I mean, they make actually, I think, really good compost, and they're very convenient and easy. We just pass stuff in. But again, the same mix, so it's not too much soggy. But don't forget to put in some woody material, a bit of cardboard and paper, as well as the green leaves and the weeds and everything.
And so having read your website, you've obviously done some trials of like green manure compost and the cow manure compost. And
Yeah.
I might be wrong, but your cow manure compost looks to me to be yielding a very slightly higher sort of yield than green manures. Is there a secret recipe? I mean, what, are you just chucking a few cowpats on the compost heap every now and again, or what's the? What are you doing? How are you making?
Yeah, I would say no secret really, but just getting that mix, the balance right, so that the compost turns out good. Probably one thing actually, which I haven't mentioned, is keeping off the rain once it's mature or finished. It's actually often not practical to cover a heap while you're adding.
It keeps the nutrients in, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, more than that though, it's keeping the air in, because rain, water displaces air, and air is such an important part of a compost heap. It's not the air that's blowing in the side, as I mentioned. The air in there is held in there by the fibrous structure of materials you add. That's why you need to have enough slightly woody bits, not logs, but just twigs, that kind of stuff, and that holds the air in. But if you have too much rain on it all the time, it tends to settle, and then it becomes anaerobic and smelly, and that's when it stops decomposing and loses quality. So maintaining air in your compost heap, and that's where one turn actually can help. So yeah, keep a cover on once you've finished any heap. If it's raining a lot, it can be worth trying to cover it actually, even in between adding. Work out what you can. And I do add a little bit of rock dust actually, and a little bit of charcoal. Not always, but I think that can help the quality of the compost and the final result and how plants grow.
Excellent. And with regards to the sort of nutrient levels, obviously, charcoal's obviously very good at creating, isn't it, sort of water retention and space in the.
Yeah, keeping it sweet as well, doesn't it? Adding a bit of sweetness to the.
Do you add any things like wood ash or sort of anything to help the sort of phosphates or the nitrates or the potassium levels?
Yeah, well, I can tell from your question, I find that very interesting actually. I would say you're more classically trained in terms of feeding plants than I am. I tend not to think in those terms.
Right.
Because my understanding is, and what I see happening, is that particularly with no-dig, because you're leaving the soil biology to flourish, those mycorrhizal networks in the soil help roots to find nutrients which are already there, but which would be more difficult for the plants to access if after cultivation.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm probably, if anyone measured it, I'm putting on less nutrients than the plants are taking out, because soil is always making more. Rocks are breaking down, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And there's a lot in soil. There's a lovely soil biologist in the USA called Elaine Ingham, a professor, who coined the phrase soil food web. And I was at a lecture she gave once, and she said, there's no soil in the world that does not already have enough nutrients for plant growth. And I thought, wow, that's an amazing statement. That's the kind of thinking. It's enabling plants to find what's already there. So I'm not working in that way so consciously, but I'm certainly not averse to putting in some wood ash, for example, because I do feel that there is potash in there. Totally correct, and they're great. And I feel the compost heap locks it in better than spreading it on the ground where it might leach through. Because that for me is the other wonderful thing about compost, is how the nutrients that are in there are held in water in soluble form. They don't wash out with rain. So we put compost on usually before Christmas actually, and then the soil's covered through the winter. The lumps break down in winter, and it's ready to go in the spring. But it means all the winter rain has washed through, like a lot this year. And yet, every year the garden's just abundant. And for me, that's saying, well, no, it's not water soluble nutrients we're putting on here. It's long-term fertility, and you're just building it all the time through the network of soil biology.
Yeah, Charles, can we just move over to seeds? And many of the commercial seed growers advocate using fresh seeds every year to obviously avoid problems. But you've already indicated that you like to save your seed potatoes. Any tips on saving your own seed and then growing it? Have you? Yeah.
Well, I've got more and more into it over the years, and it's a bit of a specialist thing. I would say if you're going to save seeds of vegetables in particular, pay attention, do some homework, and make sure you know what you're doing. It's not a random thing. So just the thing about selecting seed from, the best plant, basically. Don't keep it from the weakest plant, but also know which vegetables you need more than one of. So, for example, there's just 4 vegetables you can easily save seed from one plant only, and that's pea, lettuce, French bean, and tomato. All the other vegetables you need to have like half a dozen, even 10, like 10 beetroot growing together for the cross-pollination, which means you get a stronger gene pool and you don't get inbreeding. So as long as you do that, which does mean more space, that's something about seed saving. It takes up a certain amount of space. Seeding plants grow bigger than the original vegetable. And then just make sure you're on hand and know when you need to look out for the right seed to catch it before it falls on the ground. All those kinds of things. It's something that needs attention. But when you get it right, the results can be amazing. And I did it last year for the first time with beetroot, actually. I'd never saved beetroot seed before. Mm-hmm. And when I sowed it last February, we transplanted late March. And by late May, it was a warm spring. But we were harvesting amazing beetroot. I was so pleased and delighted.
Gosh, excellent.
I hardly quite believe it. You don't always get success like that, but when it comes off, it's brilliant. And one thing that got me into it was how seed quality has gone down of a lot of the old traditional vegetables. You know, things like Evesham Special Brussels sprout, you know, is it actually that special anymore? I don't think it's been well looked after, and that's because the seed companies make better money from F1 hybrids, so they look after them more. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, anyone who's, I'd say, you know, heirloom, heritage, be careful. It's not necessarily good just because it's called that.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And obviously the other side of that coin is if you're not rotating the ground possibly and the seeds are getting inbred, you can end up with some sort of quite serious diseases. So you haven't come across that yet or had any problems with that, I take it?
No, not at all. Yeah, really not, actually.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, if you're following a decent regime, then there's no reason why you should, because you're outbreeding and looking for strengths in plants by selecting a good gene pool. So hopefully you should be improving the Evesham Special rather than it becoming flavourless and what have you. No, that's brilliant.
That's very much my thought. And, you know, the other thing is when you save your own seed, you're basically keeping something that's used to where it's growing. So it's adapted to the climate, the soil, the conditions, and that's definitely a strong point, whatever else you will do.
No, without a doubt.
Anyway, all I can say is it's just an interesting observation we made only just recently. We were selecting potatoes for seed, and I had 2 varieties. One was Nicola. Last year I thought I'll try a new variety, and I bought some Nicola seed. Yep. And then at the same time, alongside it, we were growing the home-saved Charlotte from Home Safe Seed. And which variety had the disease? It was Nicola. There's some kind of ring spot virus on it. And we also had blackleg. And that must have come from the seed that I bought in.
Yep.
So, you know, that
blackleg is a bacterial disease, isn't it? That is grown in, but is found in weak seed potatoes. So that's where they say.
Well, I've only ever seen it from you. I get it on odd plants. It's clearly come with the seed, because otherwise, why would it be there? It's very striking. So, you know, all the time it's so interesting making observations like this. And I'm really in favour of home safe seed, but do it well. You know, it's not random.
Charles, on Dig It, we often talk about global warming and obviously climate change impacting on the way we garden and our gardens. How do you feel your no-dig philosophy will sit as the changes of our climate become obviously ever more apparent?
Well, it's a winner. It's an absolute winner, because, you know, no-dig ticks so many nice boxes. You get better moisture retention. So in a hot, dry summer, you've got less watering to do. And also we noticed with the Dig No Dig trial, the watering is easier because you're putting water onto the surface compost and it just soaks in really easily. And then if you get a heavy storm, it doesn't run off, it soaks in. And then the drainage is excellent as well. So I find, you know, in really wet weather, the garden doesn't get soggy. It's pretty heavy soil here. It's a heavy silt over clay. But we don't have any problem. We can get on the ground at any time of year because the mud doesn't stick to your boots because you haven't disturbed the soil. I was giving a talk once in Scotland near Perth, and this guy came up at the end and he said, I'm a farmer. He said, it's always raining up here. And he said, I really like my no-dig vegetable garden because I don't get mud on my boots. And, I just thought that's a really nice little bonus. And so, I would feel very confident, actually, that it's the way to go from this point of view, among many others.
Have you noticed any sort of changes in times of years when you're sowing your seeds in the last, say, 30, 40 years?
So particularly frost tender plants, because we certainly still get those late frosts we had. Do you remember during that lockdown spring, and it was a really warm April, and then we had those icy nights, 2 or 3. We had -2 here on May the 14th. And, although we'd had this amazing warm spring before, that meant that any courgettes, tomatoes, sweet corn, they were goners. So generally, for warmth-loving plants, I'm sticking to the timetable, but I'm maybe sowing a little bit earlier, things like onions, lettuce, spinach, beetroot, which don't get killed by frost, but can benefit from the slightly earlier warmth. The winters have been more open, but then, we had we had -9 centigrade here in December last year, 2022. And, that did some damage. So I think, okay, so it's maybe a little warmer, but you still got extremes. I would urge anyone not to vary too much from, the pattern that we've got used to following, the dates that are the best ones.
Excellent. And I read recently you've got 3 beehives now on your land.
Yeah.
Did that make an increase in your yields last year, do you think?
Not really, because I suppose most of what I'm growing, it's not like I'm not growing sunflowers or almonds or it's these vegetables which are not really flowering much, and tomatoes and beans. I guess the insects and wild bees actually do a fantastic job. I see a lot of bumblebees here, and on the dahlias as well. So it's not hasn't made a huge difference in the garden, but we do see a lot of honeybees, and it's very nice to have a bit of honey. We didn't get a huge amount, but it's really tasty.
How are you getting on with them? You enjoying it?
Well, to be honest, I don't really do it. I go up to the hives a couple of times a year. I probably shouldn't say that, but I work with a company called Black Bee, and they do most of the work on looking after the hives.
So are they trying to breed the native black bee then?
Yeah, that's right. We have they're called buckfast bees.
Buckfast bees,
yeah. Are you a beekeeper? It sounds like you might be.
Yeah. I've been doing it for about, I would say 8 or 9 years now.
Brilliant.
I love it. It's a fun, it's sort of one of those hobbies that you think, why on earth am I looking after a whole load of insects that will sting me? But they have so many good properties that you can't do anything.
I couldn't agree more. And you always meet beekeepers, well, like gardeners really, they're nearly always happy people.
Yeah.
Good vibes.
Definitely. Thank you.
So we like to put our expert guests on the spot. So if you're ever stranded on that desert island, which plant or perhaps piece of gardening equipment would you like to be stranded with, and perhaps why?
Okay. My plant would be garlic.
Okay.
Because I really value it for health. I eat a bit of raw garlic every morning, and I think it's a fantastic way of maintaining good, healthy body. And my tool, I think it would either be a trowel or a wooden dibber. I've got my long-handled wooden dibber, and I find it's very useful. You can do a bit of weeding with it, and you can make a hole to pop in plants. I'd have a bit of fun with that one. I think something different.
Excellent. Good stuff. So Charles, finally, how do our Dig It listeners find out more about you, your Dig It channels, and your books? It's 10 books so far?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I mean, I brought out a lot of books recently. On my website, there's a web page that has a description of all the books I've written. I recommend just having a browse around my website. Actually, there's a lot of information there about No Dig and how you can do it, and stuff you can buy if you want to find out more, like the books, and also links to videos that you can watch on YouTube. I've got a big YouTube channel. You can find me on Instagram as well, where there's a lot of gardeners, so there's often good conversations as well. And Twitter I'm on, and Facebook. So, there's plenty of access to what I'm up to. And I get out and give talks, giving a talk at Derby Book Festival, for example, in May this year. And keep an eye on my website events page, because that's got all those things that are coming up.
Right, Charles, we'll make sure all your links go onto our show page on the podcast website. So, but great, thank you for this afternoon of No Dig gardening. It's been really engaging and absolutely fascinating. And I think you've got probably 2 new converts.
Definitely. Well, I think I might have to go and dig some compost up from the garden centre and take it home and chuck it on the allotment. start there, I think.
I'm honoured. It's been nice talking to you.
Charles, thank you very much for your time.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Today's show was brought to you by Buckingham Garden Centre and Nurseries. The show was hosted by Chris Day and Peter Brown. The show was produced by Peter Brown. And our thanks to Chiltern Music Therapy for providing the music. Thanks for listening.
At Chiltern Music Therapy, we want everyone to know the difference that music can make in their lives. From parents and their premature babies in hospital to grandparents with dementia. We provide music therapy and community music services to people of all ages and needs across England. We work both digitally and in person in people's homes, care homes, schools, hospitals and hospices. Find out more at chilternmusictherapy.co.uk.